Dakota Creek, late September. In places like this, winter doesn't arrive politely. It takes ground time and men who hesitate. By the third week of the month, most cabins along the creek were already sealed. Logs stacked, gaps chinked, wood piles measured and counted like rations before a siege. The rule was simple: if your shelter wasn't finished before the river skimmed with ice, you were already behind. That was why the laughter started. While other men sat inside sharpening tools or counting supplies, one cabin was still surrounded by noise. Hammer blows, saw teeth biting wood, poles being dragged across frozen ground. The sound carried farther than it should have, because in the Yukon, silence usually means readiness. Noise means risk. Men stepped out onto their porches and shook their heads. Not because the work was sloppy, it wasn't, but because it looked unnecessary, wasteful, late. The cabin itself was already done. Solid spruce logs, tight corners, clean chinking. By local standards, it was ready to face winter. But instead of stopping, the builder was erecting a second structure around it. Thin poles set in the ground, cross braces lashed tight, and then something no one expected: canvas. Heavy cotton canvas was unrolled and lifted into place, wrapping the cabin like a coat no one asked for. It hung inches away from the log walls, pale and loose in the wind. To the men watching, it looked wrong. Temporary. Like a tent pretending to be a house. That's when the comments came. Jokes about sailors who didn't understand land, about fabric that wouldn't last a season, about cold that no cloth could stop. In frontier camps, mockery was a way of enforcing rules. Build fast, build thick, don't experiment when winter is waiting. But the man working didn't answer them. He kept measuring, kept spacing the poles, kept hammering battens into place with steady hands. He wasn't building to impress anyone. He was building for a winter that didn't care what the crowd believed. And that difference between building for approval and building for survival was about to matter more than anyone on Dakota Creek understood. The man they laughed at was not young, and he was not reckless. He was in his early 40s, with the posture of someone who had spent most of his life bracing against moving forces: wind, water, rolling decks. He did not hurry because he had learned long before the Yukon that speed was not the same thing as safety. Back home, before gold drew him inland, his work had been coastal: fishing boats, cargo runs, seasonal labor that paid only if you understood weather better than it understood you. Out there, mistakes were immediate. If you misread wind, you didn't get cold, you went under. That kind of work trains a man to think in systems, not parts. Wholesale rigging, clothing, shelter, everything layered, everything dependent. That background mattered more than most people on Dakota Creek realized. Many of the men around him were skilled carpenters. They knew how to cut straight logs, notch tight corners, and mix chinking that looked solid in September. Their thinking was rooted in strength. Thicker walls, tighter joints, more wood. The solution to cold in their minds was always more. This man thought differently. He thought about flow, about pressure, about what happens when moving air meets a warm surface. He had seen what wind could pull apart and what it could be slowed by. On boats, no one trusted a single layer between themselves and the sea. You wore wool under oilskin, canvas over wood, air trapped where it could help you. When he worked on his cabin, he moved with the same rhythm he had used at sea. Measure twice, space evenly, brace against forces that hadn't arrived yet. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering. To the others, his delay looked like poor judgment. Another week of work meant another week closer to freeze up. Another week not spent digging claims or hauling wood. But from his point of view, stopping early would have been the real risk. He understood something many frontier builders missed: winter doesn't reward effort. It rewards correct preparation. You don't get credit for working hard. You only get to stay warm or not. So while others finished fast and trusted tradition, he kept building a system. Not because he wanted to be different, but because his experience told him that winter punishes confidence more than ignorance. And the Yukon winter was coming either way. On the frontier, a good cabin was judged by how it looked in September. Straight walls, heavy logs, tight corners, chinking, packed until no daylight showed through. If it stood solid and felt warm on a calm night, most men called it finished. That standard worked until the wind arrived. Thick logs have weight. They store heat. That's true. But they do a poor job stopping moving air. And moving air is what kills heat fastest. Most frontier builders didn't separate those ideas. They believed mass alone meant warmth. If cold got inside, the answer was simple burn, more wood. The problem was the walls themselves. Logs shrink when temperatures drop. Chinking dries cracks and pulls away. Those gaps don't look serious at first. You can't always feel them with your hand. But wind doesn't need big openings. It only needs pathways. Once pressure builds on the windward side of a cabin, cold air is forced through every weakness, while warm air is pulled out through others. That process is constant, invisible, relentless. A stove can heat air. It cannot stop air from leaving. In a windy environment, a cabin becomes a pump. Cold air pushed in, warm air sucked out. The harder the wind blows, the faster heat disappears. Men mistake this for bad cold, when it's actually bad control. Thick walls help only when air is still. On calm nights, a solid log cabin performs well. That's why so many shelters feel adequate early in the season. But winter doesn't test buildings on calm nights. It tests them during storms. Frontier builders knew logs were strong. What they didn't fully understand was that strength and insulation are not the same thing. A 9-inch log slows heat loss by conduction, but it does nothing to stop infiltration. And infiltration is where most heat is lost. Modern builders have names for this now: air sealing, pressure differentials, thermal leakage. Back then, men just felt it as cold fingers reaching through walls, no matter how much wood they burned. The mistake wasn't poor craftsmanship, it was incomplete thinking. Cabins were built to resist gravity, not wind. And winter, especially northern winter, doesn't care how thick your walls are if the air won't stay put. That was the weakness the canvas coat was about to expose. Most men on Dakota Creek blamed cold for their suffering. They talked about low temperatures the way sailors talk about deep water, as if numbers alone explained danger. But cold by itself is quiet. It sits still. It doesn't reach for you. Wind does. A calm night at 0 degrees can be uncomfortable, but manageable. A windy night at 20 above can strip heat from a body faster than a man can replace it. That truth was well known at sea, but poorly understood on land. Frontier builders planned for cold. They did not plan for moving air. Wind works by pressure. When it hits one side of a cabin, it pushes air inward. At the same time, it pulls air out from the opposite side. This creates continuous exchange. Warm air leaves. Cold air replaces it. The stove becomes a losing machine, pouring heat into a space that cannot hold it. Men felt this but misread the cause. They blamed thin chinking. They blamed poor stoves. They blamed bad luck. What they were fighting was physics. You can see wind's effect without instruments. A candle flame near a wall will lean. Smoke from a pipe will drift sideways indoors. Curtains move when no door is open. These are not small problems. They are evidence that the shelter is breathing, and in winter, breathing is deadly. The worst part is that wind makes buildings feel unreliable. Temperatures swing. 1 hour feels tolerable, the next unbearable. Men respond by feeding the stove harder, opening dampers, wasting fuel in short bursts that don't solve the real problem. The fire gets hotter. The cabin does not. This is where most winter failures begin, not with bad materials, but with unstable conditions. A shelter that changes temperature constantly forces people to stay alert, to keep waking up, to keep reacting. Fatigue sets in, judgment slips, mistakes follow. Wind turns cabins into labor. The canvas system wasn't designed to add warmth directly. It was designed to remove wind from the equation. By taking the pressure hit outside the logs, it stopped the push-pull effect that drove infiltration. Inside air slowed down, temperature stabilized, fires worked the way they were supposed to. Cold is survivable. Wind unmanaged is not, and the men who laughed hadn't yet learned which enemy mattered more. The canvas coat didn't come from a single clever moment. It was not a trick, and it wasn't invention in the way frontier stories usually describe invention. It was something older than that. A pattern repeated across places where winter kills people who ignore it. In Northern Europe, houses were rarely left exposed. Log walls were often covered with board siding not for decoration, but to take weather abuse so the structure beneath could stay stable. The outer layer aged. The inner layer stayed warm. Builders there didn't argue about which wall did the work. They understood the job was shared. On the coast, the lesson was even clearer. No fisherman trusted bare wood against wind and spray. Boats were layered, canvas over frames, tarred cloth over seams, air trapped where it could help, not harm. The goal was never to block weather completely, it was to slow it down. Then there were tents. Anyone who had slept in a wall tent with a proper fly knew the difference immediately. A single canvas wall flaps leaks heat and sweats inside. Add a second skin spaced correctly and the interior changes. Wind loses its bite. Moisture moves outward. The fire holds longer. That isn't comfort, it's control. Indigenous shelters followed the same principle. Snow houses, windbreaks, double-layered skins, not heavy, not airtight, just enough separation to stop moving air and trap warmth where people lived. These systems weren't fragile, they were tuned. The man wrapping his cabin didn't talk about any of this. He didn't need to. He wasn't trying to teach. He was applying ideas he had seen work under pressure, different places, same physics. That's what most observers missed. They saw canvas and thought tent. They thought temporary, weak, improvised. What they were really looking at was a weather shell, a sacrificial layer designed to take punishment, so the structure behind it didn't have to. The logs weren't replaced. They were protected, turned into thermal mass instead of wind barriers. The cabin became layered like clothing, like boats, like shelters that had evolved where mistakes were fatal. It wasn't cleverness that made the system work. It was respect for how heat and wind actually behave. And that respect had been earned long before anyone laughed on Dakota Creek. What made the canvas system work was not the fabric. It was the thinking behind how everything was spaced, anchored, and allowed to move. Men who later tried to copy the idea and failed usually focused on the wrong part. They chased materials instead of geometry. The frame came first. Slim poles set around the cabin, not touching it, but standing just far enough out to create a consistent gap. Not random distance, not about right. A deliberate space wide enough to slow air, narrow enough to stay stable in wind. Every pole was braced. Every brace anticipated sideways force, not weight. That alone told you this wasn't decorative. The canvas wasn't stretched tight like a drum. Tight fabric tears. It also transmits pressure directly. Instead, it was hung firm but forgiving, able to move slightly with gusts. Wind that can move a surface loses energy. Wind that hits something rigid transfers it. Seams mattered. Overlap mattered more. 12 inches wasn't excessive. It was insurance. One weak seam turns an outer shell into a wind scoop. That was understood clearly. No shortcuts. At the bottom, the fabric wasn't left flapping. It was buried, ground sealed. Cold air loves low openings. So do rodents. Closing that gap stopped both. At the top, however, nothing was sealed completely. Narrow vents were left under simple hoods. Warm, moist air had to escape somewhere. If it didn't, it would condense, freeze, and rot the structure from the inside. This balance, closed at the bottom, breathing at the top, was the heart of the system. Too tight and you trap moisture, too loose and you lose heat. The goal wasn't isolation, it was regulation. Inside the air gap, conditions changed. Wind slowed, temperatures moderated. Frost formed where it could do no harm. The inner logs stayed drier and warmer. The stove worked steadily instead of wildly. Anyone could see the materials: poles, nails, canvas. What took experience to see was why each decision existed. This wasn't extra work, it was targeted work. Work done where it mattered most. Frontier survival isn't about doing more. It's about doing the right things in the right order, for the right reasons. The canvas coat was proof of that. The most important part of the system wasn't wood or canvas. It was the space in between. 4 to 6 inches of nothing. Air that didn't move. That kind of air is called dead air, and it is one of the best insulators nature has ever produced. Not because it generates heat, but because it refuses to carry it away. Heat moves easily through solid materials. It moves quickly through moving air. But still, air resists change. People understand this instinctively with clothing. A wool shirt works because it traps air. Fur works because it traps air. Feathers work because they trap air. The material is secondary. The trapped space is what matters. Most cabins had no controlled dead air space. Any air between the inside and outside was moving, pushed by wind through gaps and cracks. That movement erased whatever insulating value the logs might have offered. The canvas coat created a deliberate boundary layer. Wind hit the outer skin first and lost speed. Any air that slipped through had to travel across the gap before reaching the logs. By the time it did, it was slower and slightly warmer. That change was enough to matter. The spacing had to be precise. Too narrow and air couples directly between layers, acting like a solid conductor. Too wide and convection begins. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. Circulation starts and insulation is lost. 4 to 6 inches was not tradition. It was tested reality. This is where many later copies failed. Men assumed more space meant more insulation. They pushed walls out too far. The gap became a wind tunnel. Others pulled the canvas tight against the logs, thinking closer meant warmer. They destroyed the air layer entirely. Dead air only works when it stays dead. Moisture control mattered just as much. Warm air carries water vapor. If that vapor condenses inside the gap with nowhere to go, it freezes. Ice bridges form. Rot follows. That's why ventilation at the top was non-negotiable. Let moisture escape upward, always upward. What the system created was not warmth, but stability. Interior temperatures stopped swinging. Fires burned evenly. People slept longer. Judgment improved. In survival, stability keeps people alive. Dead air provides that stability quietly, invisibly, without effort. It doesn't ask for fuel, it doesn't break, it just stays where you put it if you respect how it works. That invisible layer was doing more work than any log in the wall. October is a liar in the north. It gives just enough comfort to convince men their shelters are good enough. A few cold nights, a light wind, fires burn, coffee stays warm, cabins pass the test they were never meant to take. This is where most bad decisions get locked in. Early cold is deceptive because it doesn't stress systems. Logs haven't shrunk much yet. Chinking still holds. Wind hasn't learned the weak spots. A cabin that will fail in January can feel perfectly fine in October, especially on calm nights. Men take that feeling as proof. On Dakota Creek, this false confidence was everywhere. Standard cabins held temperature reasonably well when the air was still. With steady fires, interiors stayed in the low 50s. That was enough to settle arguments, enough to reinforce tradition. But the canvas-wrapped cabin told a different story the moment the wind showed up. The first real blows didn't bring record cold. They brought movement. 20-25 mile-per-hour gusts running down the valley. Nothing dramatic, just enough to expose differences. Inside the standard cabins, men noticed drafts before they saw thermometer drops. Candle flames leaned. Stove dampers needed constant adjustment. Fires burned hotter, but rooms felt colder. Heat was being made and stolen at the same time. In the wrapped cabin, none of that happened. Temperatures stayed steady. The fire didn't need babysitting. Air inside felt calm even while the canvas skin moved outside. That contrast wasn't subtle. It just wasn't loud enough yet to change minds. This is the danger of shoulder season testing. It rewards systems that perform well under easy conditions and hides flaws that only appear under stress. By the time real winter arrives, it's too late to rebuild. Frontier history is full of shelters that passed October and failed December. Men trusted early comfort instead of waiting for proof. They mistook not bad yet for good enough. The canvas coat didn't shine because it was warm. It shined because it behaved the same way, regardless of wind. That consistency was the warning sign experienced men should have paid attention to. Winter doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It exposes weak thinking slowly, then all at once. October gives you just enough time to make the wrong call, and just enough comfort to believe you made the right one. The real test didn't arrive gradually. It came the way northern weather often does, fast, heavy, and without concern for preparation schedules. A short, warm spell laid down wet snow heavy enough to load roofs and soak clothing. Then, without warning, the temperature collapsed. In less than half a day, the valley went from tolerable to lethal. Cold alone is dangerous. Cold plus wind is arithmetic. Outside, temperatures dropped past 30 below. Gusts cut through the creek bottom hard enough to rock doors on their hinges. This wasn't discomfort. This was heat loss measured in minutes. Inside the standard cabins, failure began quietly. Chinking cracked as logs contracted. Hairline gaps became air channels. Wind pressure forced cold air through every weakness, while warm air was pulled out just as fast. Men fed their stoves harder. Fires roared. Thermometers fell anyway. This is where winter stops caring about effort. Wood consumption spiked. Stoves needed constant attention. Men stopped sleeping in full stretches. Someone always had to be awake. That kind of schedule works for a night or two. It doesn't work for a storm that doesn't end. The numbers didn't lie. A small iron stove can only produce so much heat. If the rate of heat loss exceeds that output, the interior temperature drops no matter how much wood you burn. At 40 below with strong wind, the math turns brutal. Cabins don't fail dramatically. They just lose ground degree by degree. Frost began forming inside, not near the door, not by the windows, on walls 3 feet from the stove. Water froze in cups, breath condensed on blankets. These are not comfort issues, they are warnings. By the middle of the night, survival decisions replaced pride. Men understood what was happening, even if they couldn't explain it. Their shelters were bleeding heat faster than they could replace it. No amount of toughness changes that equation. When the decision was made to abandon a failing cabin, it wasn't panic. It was clarity. Stay and burn through fuel until the fire dies or move. That's when the numbers became undeniable. One shelter on the creek was holding steady above freezing. The others were not. This wasn't about cleverness anymore. It was about where the math still worked. When the men reached the wrapped cabin, the difference was immediate and physical. The door opened and warm air didn't rush out in a desperate burst. It held. That alone told the story. Inside, the temperature was steady, not comfortable by summer standards, but safe, above freezing by a wide margin, stable enough that the stove wasn't being fought every minute. This was the real advantage of the system, not higher peak heat, but control. The canvas shell had taken the wind's force and broken it apart before it ever reached the logs. Pressure stayed outside. Inside air was calm, no drafts pulling heat away, no sudden swings that forced constant adjustment. The stove could do its job because the room stopped leaking energy faster than it could be made. Men noticed it right away. Candle flames burned straight. You could stand near a wall without feeling cold creep across your back. Coats came off slowly at first, then without hesitation. Hands stopped shaking. Breathing eased. Bodies recognized safety before minds fully caught up. Fuel use told the rest of the story. While other cabins had been fed every 30 minutes just to slow their decline, this one needed attention far less often. Not because the fire was stronger, but because the heat stayed put. That difference meant rest, sleep, clear thinking. A good shelter does more than keep you warm. It reduces labor. It gives people back time and energy. In extreme conditions, that matters as much as temperature. The wrapped cabin also handled crowding better. 8 men in a small space added body heat, moisture, and movement. In most cabins, that would have caused condensation and frost buildup. Here, moisture moved outward and escaped. The system was already designed to breathe in the right direction. By morning, the conclusion was obvious. This wasn't luck. It wasn't better wood. It wasn't a stronger stove. It was a shelter that worked with physics instead of fighting it. The cabin had become a lifeboat not because it was warmer, but because it was predictable. In winter, predictability keeps people alive. When the wind finally broke and the temperature climbed back to something merely dangerous, the creek went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of rest, but the exhausted silence that follows a hard lesson. Men stepped out to assess damage, not with curiosity, but with a need to understand what had almost killed them. The evidence was everywhere. Standard cabins stood intact but defeated. Doors warped. Frost-lined interior walls in strange, uneven patterns. Chinking had pulled loose in places no one could reach without tearing walls apart. Woodpiles were smaller than they should have been, for so early in the winter. The math was clear. At that burn rate, spring was going to be a long way off. Inside the wrapped cabin, the story was different. The logs were dry to the touch. Frost sat where it belonged, outside the living space, trapped safely in the air gap. The stove showed no signs of overfiring. The woodpile was diminished, but not alarmingly so. Most important of all, everyone had slept. Frontiermen didn't argue with results. They argued with theories, and this wasn't theory anymore. There were no speeches. No one apologized for the laughter. They didn't need to. Pride has a way of going quiet when numbers speak clearly. Fuel consumed, temperatures held, lives preserved. That was the full accounting. Men ran their hands along the canvas seams, counted nails spacing, measured the gap between fabric and logs with gloved fingers. These weren't gestures of admiration. They were acts of recalculation. What would it take to do this on my own cabin? How much material? How much time? What could be salvaged? Winter had shifted the standard. The question was no longer, does this look right? It was, did this work when everything else failed? That kind of proof doesn't need explaining. It spreads quietly from one practical man to another, not as a story, but as a solution. The first attempts to copy the canvas system came fast, and many of them failed. Not because the idea was flawed, but because the lesson was misunderstood. Some men focused on the fabric alone. They wrapped canvas tight against their log walls, thinking closeness meant warmth. What they created was a wet skin. Moisture condensed, froze, and soaked into the logs. Within weeks, frost crept inward instead of staying outside. The dead air was gone, and with it, the advantage. Others made the opposite mistake. They pushed the outer layer too far out, believing more space meant better insulation. The gap became a chimney. Warm air rose, cold air fell, and circulation erased any benefit. The shelter breathed constantly, just in a larger loop. Fuel use stayed high. Comfort didn't improve. A few sealed everything completely. No gaps, no vents, no breathing. Those cabins felt warm at first, then failed quietly. Ice formed inside walls. Wood softened. Mold appeared where no one could see it. The structure survived the storm, but not the season. The men who succeeded were the ones who understood the principle, not the appearance. They copied the spacing. They braced for wind, not weight. They sealed low and vented high. They accepted that movement was necessary, but only in one direction. This is where frontier knowledge often breaks down. Techniques get passed along without context. People remember what was used, not why it was used. Canvas becomes the magic ingredient. It never was. The real lesson was control. Control of air, control of pressure, control of moisture. The outer shell was just a tool to achieve that. Those who understood this built shelters that improved dramatically with modest effort. Those who didn't ended up with heavier, wetter, more fragile cabins than before. Innovation on the frontier was never about copying perfectly. It was about adapting correctly, and adaptation only works when the underlying logic is respected. Winter doesn't punish mistakes evenly. It punishes misunderstandings first. What happened on Dakota Creek didn't stay there. It just lost its story and kept its function. Over time, builders stopped talking about canvas coats and started talking about walls that worked better. The language changed, but the physics didn't. As cabins turned into houses and camps turned into towns, the same ideas quietly reappeared under new names. Board siding over log walls wasn't decoration. It was protection. Tar paper wasn't about waterproofing alone. It was about stopping wind. Air gaps behind siding weren't mistakes. They were intentional spaces that let moisture escape while slowing heat loss. Men didn't explain these choices with formulas. They explained them by saying, "This one stays warmer." Modern building science eventually caught up and gave the old ideas technical names. Rain screen systems, air barriers, pressure equalization, thermal breaks. None of these are new discoveries. They're formal descriptions of what practical builders already knew when failure meant freezing. Engineers now measure what those men felt. Most heat loss in cold climates doesn't come from walls being too thin. It comes from air moving where it shouldn't. Stop the movement and suddenly the same wall performs far better. Even tents still teach the lesson. Any experienced winter camper will tell you that a fly matters more than thicker canvas. The fly breaks wind traps, dead air, and stabilizes temperature. Exactly the same principle scaled up. What's important for people today is this: the solution wasn't exotic. It didn't require rare materials or advanced tools. It required thinking about how heat leaves a space and how wind forces it out. That's still true. You can insulate forever and still feel cold if air is moving through your walls. Or you can control air and suddenly modest systems work far beyond expectation. That's the difference between brute force and design. The men who survived Dakota Creek didn't invent modern building science. They proved it under conditions where being wrong had immediate consequences. The rest of the world took a century to write it down. In the end, the lesson wasn't about canvas. It wasn't even about cabins. It was about how people survive when comfort disappears and only outcomes matter. The men who nearly froze that winter were not careless. They worked hard. They followed accepted wisdom. They built the way they had been taught to build. What failed them wasn't effort, it was assumption. The belief that thicker walls and harder labor would always be enough. The man who wrapped his cabin thought differently. He didn't ask how strong his shelter looked. He asked how heat moved, how wind behaved, and how much fuel a man could realistically burn day after day without collapsing. He built for limits, not ideals. That's the core of frontier thinking at its best. Real survival is not about toughness. Tough men freeze as fast as anyone else. It's about designing systems that reduce work instead of demanding more of it. A shelter that holds heat buys you sleep. Sleep buys you judgment. Judgment keeps you alive. This is why old knowledge matters. Not because it's romantic, but because it was tested under pressure modern life rarely applies. Those systems weren't optimized for convenience. They were optimized for endurance. The canvas coat worked because it respected reality. Wind exists, moisture exists, fuel is finite, bodies get tired. Ignore any one of those and winter will teach you the rest. That lesson still applies today. Whether you live off-grid heat, a rural home, or just want to understand why some buildings feel solid while others never do, the principle is the same. Control air, layer protection. Let systems breathe where they must and seal where they matter. Frontier wisdom isn't about going backward. It's about remembering what happens when failure has consequences. When winter doesn't care how confident you feel, only whether your shelter actually works. Build like it matters, because sometimes it does.